Welcome to Perspectives with Wenchi Yu, where we discuss Trump 2.0's policies and politics and their implications for Asia, China, Taiwan, and beyond. Australia's relationship with China is often overshadowed by the US-China rivalry. Yet for Australia, China is not a distant geopolitical question. It is Australia's largest trading partner, a major source of migration and international students, an essential science and technology research collaborator, and a strategic challenge in the Indo-Pacific. How does a middle power manage such a consequential relationship? And how can universities, among the country's most globally connected institutions, remain open, competitive, and secure amid geopolitical fragmentation? As a new academic year begins, I speak with Philipp Ivanov, Chief Global Resilience Officer at the Melbourne-based RMIT University and a former Australian diplomat. We discuss Australia's evolving China policy, the future of Chinese student enrollment and research collaboration, and how universities can manage risks without abandoning international engagement. Let's hear Philipp's perspective. So welcome, Philipp. So excited to have you on today's episode. We haven't really touched on Australia, and so I am particularly excited to hear your view, especially in the higher ed space. So tell us about your career.
First of all, thank you, Wenchi, for inviting me on your podcast. Delighted to contribute. So my career has always been about education and international relations. Always really interested in how countries and people get along or do not get along, and the role of education in making the world work a little better. I started my career in the university sector back in Russia, where I was born. I left Russia when I was fairly young and spent 6 years in China, mainly in education sector.
Was it a university in China or was it commercial education?
It was both university as well as the school sector. And when I moved to Australia over 22 years ago, I also worked in the university sector, particularly working in scholarships and partnerships area before joining Australian Ministry of Foreign Affairs as a diplomat. After that, I joined as a CEO of Asia Society Australia and later as Vice President of Asia Society in New York. Now I find myself in the higher education sector again at RMIT University.
You've spent time in Russia, China, the United States, Australia. So you have a pretty broad perspective of where things are right now. Sitting in Australia right now, what are you seeing in terms of the past few years of Australia and China relationship? I think most people pay attention to US, China, Europe, China, some Canada-China relationship, but Australia actually went through a pretty up and down few years with China, right?
China is Australia's most complex and I would say most important relationship.
Most important. Okay.
For a number of reasons. One, it's by far our largest trading partner. It's also the largest source of migrants until recently, I think, when it's been overtaken by India. We have over 1.2 million out of the population of 27 million of Australians with Chinese heritage. So a very large percentage of the population. We're obviously, unlike Europe and the United States, we are in the region that China is trying to influence very actively. We're also part of that Asia vertical in terms of our trade, in terms of the maritime logistics and supply chains. So it's a highly complex relationship. Obviously, we're also very close to the United States as our security and investment partner, which in the current US-China competition environment creates a very difficult situation for Australia. At the moment, we found some equilibrium, which our Prime Minister describes as stabilization.
So you actually think Australia has found this equilibrium with China?
At the moment, it is a very fragile equilibrium because from about...
It's probably dynamic, right?
Yes, from about 2020, 2023 23, 24, we had a very difficult relationship with China that started deteriorating from about 2017. Underneath this stabilization and this equilibrium, there are some fairly difficult contradictions. One, of course, is the completely divergent vision for the Indo-Pacific. We are one of U.S. closest allies in the world and in Asia. Australian policy generally supports the U.S. military and economic involvement in Asia.
What about the business sector and the general public?
Yeah, so the kind of reassessment of the relationship with China started almost a decade ago. So there's been some profound shifts in how business, universities, and society generally looks at.
What prompted that?
What prompted it is, well, first and most importantly, is the shift in Chinese foreign policy and diplomacy. First, it became much more assertive under President Xi. Australia was, for example, one of the pioneers of legislation on foreign interference, which was triggered by some of the disagreements with China over its actions in Australia. So we've been fairly clear about sort of these red lines when it comes to foreign interference. And so as a result, that the relationship has changed. But interestingly, the trade and economic relationship with China is robust, and it almost returned to its pre-crisis levels, partly because China's role in the commodities market is very robust. So that really kept the relationship intact. And in addition to commodities, which is iron ore and coal, agricultural commodities are the key. The academic higher education relationship, both in research and students, has also survived. So it created the ballast to diplomatic and foreign policy disagreements.
Let's talk about that academic relationship. Maybe help us understand how strong or connected that relationship is. For example, do we know the percentage or number of Chinese students in the universities or in graduate school? What are we talking about?
Chinese students in Australia is the largest student cohort out of all international students. The preliminary research that we saw is that almost 1 in 5 papers co-written by Australian academics have a Chinese co-author. It's different across different universities, but on average, that seems to be the case. We also have a very large percentage of senior, especially science and engineering academics that have either come from China or have strong connections with China. Despite some challenges, particularly COVID, when the borders were closed, that relationship has remained steady, driven by Australian universities' very proactive recruitment program in China. It's also been driven, of course, by the demand for higher education from China itself. The other side of that relationship is research, both in terms of joint publications and joint projects funding PhD students. At various points over the last 10 years, Australia was either number 3 or number 4 most popular destination for Chinese students after US and UK. So it drops between Canada and Australia. But it is also changing now, not only because of the geopolitical headwinds, but also by the fact that Chinese universities are becoming much better. So we see from probably last year a gradual decline in the number of Chinese students in Australia. And so that's, I think, is a longer-term trend.
So let me ask you, a lot of countries, and this is not just about China, because of the closure of borders, the exchange of students or international student, the number went down. And then some came back specifically with China. Let's just use US and China as an example. The number has never come back. American students going to China remain really low, even though there's still a lot of Chinese students in the US, but the number has also gone down. What is the situation in Australia, let's say, since COVID?
So since COVID, there was a post-COVID rebound to the numbers before 2020. That was really just a pent-up demand from the couple of years when Australia was closed. And then from about 2024, 25, we started seeing the demand dropping
Demand of which side?
from China to Australia. In April, visa numbers shows that offshore Chinese student visa applications are down 30% compared to the same time last year. It is part of those structural shifts, but it's also a part of the economic slowdown in China, a bit of uncertainty about whether it's worth the investment. A degree in Australia would cost from 50 to 100,000 Australian dollars a year. So it's a significant investment, especially for middle-class families. So when you weigh all this and then the greater variety of other providers around the world, whether it's Europe, Canada, Asia itself, Japan, Korea, Singapore, then perhaps Australia, in my view, is losing a bit of that competitiveness. Politics also play a role a bit. We had a very robust debate about the immigration and housing shortages. Some of our right-leaning politicians blamed international students for some of the migration issues.
What about Australian students going to China?
That is not a good story generally, particularly from COVID pandemic. We see pretty big drop in the number of Australian students going to China. I participated in the study of just overall how Australia looks at Asia literacy. The number of Australian students just generally engaging with Chinese studies, very disappointing. We actually do not graduate students with Chinese skills.
What's the reason?
Part of the reason is this kind of persistent monolingual culture in Australia, that both the combination of cultural factors and the government education policy that was not encouraging students pursuing any languages at all, including Asian languages. The situation is even more depressing when it comes to Indonesian or Vietnamese or other languages. Despite the fact that the government had offered a number of scholarships for Australian students to go to China, it hasn't created a greater demand. I don't have the numbers of how many Australian students are in China now, but I would say it's probably within under 100, if not significantly fewer.
Let's talk about RMIT, the university where you work now. What kind of university is that, and what is your role as the Chief Global Resilience Officer?
RMIT is an international university of design and technology, and we've been around for over 100 years, and it's one of Australia's most international universities. And so the kind of global engagement has always been a part of its DNA. It's a very entrepreneurial global place. We have 2 campuses in Vietnam, which we had for over 30 years. So we're one of the largest providers of higher education in Vietnam, with presence in both Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh City. We teach in multiple locations around the world, in Singapore, in China, in Hong Kong, India. I have an office in Barcelona in Spain, which does a lot of our coordination work on European research, as well as planning to have expansion of our presence in Indonesia and in India. So it's a very international place. Like most universities that are engaged internationally, it hasn't been immune from geopolitical and geoeconomic tensions. As an international place that wants to maintain its international ambition, they also need to start thinking about the risk and security aspect. My position was created in response to this.
What risks are you looking at, and how have you been able to help the university assess the risks and set up the framework to mitigate those risks?
The way we frame our posture as an international university is that we need to be a resilient institution, not just a risk manager, which implies that you're reactive to what's going on in the world, but truly looking ahead, looking over the horizon and see what are the big forces that's going to shape research and education globally. Well, the way we look at it is there's five big forces. One is the major power competition, and particularly US, going to be reflected in our connections with both countries. The second is economic fragmentation. So there's rupture of the trade order and how it's going to impact, international universities like ours. The third is the technological competition. So what does that mean for teaching, for research, for our students, particularly AI and the competition there? And then the fourth is our own government's increasing burden on national security compliance on universities, how we respond to that. And then finally, as the same as in the US, we see some pretty significant societal polarization. We also had the protests over the conflict in Gaza, for example, which really ruptured the campus in multiple camps. So these five things collided in the last 5 years and created this perfect storm.
So how do you do the resilience building? Because almost 50% of your students are international. Obviously, it's not just China. It's also India, as you mentioned, also other countries. How do you prioritize what is most important? Is it about, for example, international student tuition, or is it about research, collaboration? How do you think about it?
First is starting from the principles. We want to continue to be an international university, so we want to stay open. There's no intention to start limiting the way we engage with the world, including with China. The second is to look at what are key partnerships and how we need to make sure that they stay active and dynamic. It means looking at our own systems and processes, which we spend quite a lot of time dealing with, like how we look at risk, how we approach risk, how we manage it, and then looking at where we can, most importantly, support our students and staff. So it's building overall risk literacy and awareness, to make sure that when our academics are teaching offshore, that they're well prepared, to make sure that our students, when they come here, they feel safe, and then they are not subject to any foreign interference or any other pressures from foreign governments or our own government for that matter. And we need to think about not just opportunities, but also the threats and risks. And then really try to build the systems that make sure that when we go into partnerships, wherever these partnerships are, that we know what we're getting into. We know the countries, we know their legal systems, we know the key people, we know what is the exit strategy if things don't go to plan. It's a combination of advice, coordination, and capacity building.
Are you seeing your peer universities taking this approach as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And we see it across the board from United States and Canada and UK have much more robust and prescriptive policies in that space. Australia remains quite flexible and less prescriptive compared to others. And so all universities, and I'm talking to my peers everywhere from Texas to, and of course here in Australia, all universities are thinking and rethinking of how they manage their international engagement in this new context.
Are there concrete policies or tools that you're using to manage those risks and build up resilience?
We'll start with having a robust due diligence process on partners, for example, something that particularly open international universities are not always good at doing. So really understanding what are the legal, what are the ethical security implications of, for example, teaching a degree in robotics offshore. It's in India or in China or elsewhere. What are the kind of political implications? What are security implications? How do we protect our IP? Where does the data live? Does the data live with our partner in India? It lives here in Australia. Where our teaching staff, how long they spend there? Do they need some special cybersecurity provisions? The other piece is the strategy overall. The US has one of the most stringent research security policies in the world at the moment, especially when it comes to China. Now, we do research with both countries. So how do we make sure that geopolitical competition is not going to clash in our research programs that we do with both countries? So to paraphrase Jake Sullivan, who is Biden's national security advisor, that idea of having small yard, high fence. How does it work in university sector? Do you do everything with everybody? Or do you have some research programs that you only do with some countries and not with others? So we are in the process of negotiating what's in the yard and how high is the fence, basically.
So who are you negotiating with? For example, are there Australian government issue policies guiding universities, or this is up to each university to define them?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. There's a bit of a policy vacuum compared to Canada and the US. The US policy is very prescriptive. We have the lists. So these are the people and the countries and entities that universities are not allowed to work with. We don't have any of these lists, and Canada has the lists as well. So our policy is much more empowering to institutions to decide their level of risk. So that makes it more difficult for us.
Yeah.
So we need to figure out what our risk appetite are, and we need to understand internally which institutions or countries or disciplines are off limits or should be protected more than others. To give you an example, is doing a fine art research collaboration with Hong Kong okay? Or is it as okay as doing the robotics research with, let's say, Iran?
So I am surprised that the government hasn't created at least some kind of guidelines around it.
There are some guidelines, but they are as more guidelines than specific prescriptions.
So there's no, for example, restriction on universities collaborating with research institutions, let's just say in China or Iran, on anything that's advanced technologies or military civil fusion. There's nothing around that.
There's broadly a guideline that it's not welcome, but it's not very explicit and it's not very detailed. So there's some work that's gone to restrict collaborations with Iran, Russia, North Korea, and Belarus, but definitely not with China, which is our key partner in education and research.
Looking at RMIT, the university wanted to stay as open, globally engaged as possible. So what are the benefits that you communicate to your stakeholders?
I guess we also started largely from the position that there is no alternative to engagement with China. Overall, there's no alternative to international research or education collaboration. China being an important and complex partner, it's impossible to take China out of the global science and technology system. That's actually quite important to have some recognition of that.
I think Australia is pretty honest about it, and perhaps because Australia is a middle power country, so it is just pragmatic in that way.
It's easier to talk about some kind of more restrictive relationship with China when you are the United States, a major technology and science power. But when you are a smaller player like us, it's very difficult to make that argument. And I think Australian government has been very conscious of that. If you start from that position that you have to engage, then it just comes to, well, is about introducing protections and risk management strategies internally to make sure that this research or education partnerships, whatever you're doing, are safe and beneficial to you, that you keep your IP, that your staff are safe, that you make money. So far, we haven't seen a cooling down effect of geopolitics or US policy or other factors on international research collaboration between China and Australia. So far, it's been held intact, but that might change.
Do you think that may change?
There is a push for universities to be more vigilant and better at risk management and better informed and less perhaps naive about the intentions of some of the players in the system. The overall policy, as well as the sentiment in the universities, is that we have to go through this process gradually. But the government, for example, is trying to do a lot about education, about what the risks are of research collaborations generally, without naming countries, apart from places like North Korea. Engage in an educational and communication campaign rather than in the more hard compliance measures that we saw. All of this is, of course, dependent on a stable leader-to-leader diplomatic relationship.
Government-to-government relationship.
If that deteriorates, which it might, because it's fairly fragile, it may have a pretty big spillover effect on education and research.
In the beginning of our conversation, you said that the relationship is relatively stable, but you now feel it could change. It's fragile. What's your pulse on Australia and China's next 3 to 5 years? Would it be determined based on who is in the government? What are the other factors?
I wrote a paper a couple of months ago, paraphrasing the famous Chinese science fiction novel, The Three-Body Problem, describing Australia's policy towards China as a three-phase problem. Because Australia is simultaneously doing three things. So it's cooperating with China, so that's trade, that's research, education, etc. We're also competing with China, particularly in the Pacific, where there's a whack-a-mole competition for influence and security. And then we counter in China, particularly in the foreign interference, espionage, and hard security issues. This is very difficult to play that game for a country of our size, competing, cooperating, and countering with such a big player. It really depends on how competent the government and the society is mobilized around that. If the Liberal coalition government, which is our Conservative Party, that's in opposition, comes to power when next elections, we'll probably see a much more hawkish stance. China recently tested a massive ballistic missile test in South Pacific that I think scared a lot of people in Australia, including our government. And so those incidents also can tip the relationship. The US is a really big factor. So far, we maintain that balance. The pressure from the United States in terms of our relationship with China has been fairly manageable, but that also depends on US relationship with China. We saw how that might play out when it comes to relationship with Europe and in the context of the Iranian conflict.
The US went through or is still going through the China shock. It kind of started, I would say, around 10 years ago. And Europe is now, a lot of people are saying, going through this China shock, deciding whether is there an overcapacity issue, how to deal with the trade tariffs. And then Australia, do you think also has gone through China shock, is going through China shock, will go through China shock?
We've definitely gone through the China shock. We were one of the first countries that reassessed our relationship with Chinese technology. We were the first to ban Huawei from being used.
When was that?
That was, I think it was 2017 from memory.
Okay, the first Trump administration, because at that time, I think it was a conservative government in Australia, right? Yeah.
And so we then gone through the shock of about being in 3 years in China's diplomatic freezer with no ministerial contacts, massive trade impediments that completely wiped out some of the Australian industries. For example, when China introduced this massive tariffs on Australian wine, the whole market disappeared. Same with some of the other agricultural exports. So we've definitely gone through China shock, but we are now at that point where there is a recognition that there is no alternative to be in some sort of relationship with China. And so you're better off have a stable, at least stable diplomatic and leader-to-leader and government-to-government connections and have the trade flows going and try to manage those differences as adeptly as you can. That's a much more mature position than perhaps what we were 10 years ago, where it went from sort of everything is great with our China relationship to everything is bad with our China relationship. Now we find some kind of middle ground.
That's why you already used the word equilibrium when I think, for example, US and China hasn't quite reached that equilibrium yet. For the next few years, ideally, what would you like to see a good, mature, healthy relationship at the university level, higher ed?
First is that we continue to welcome Chinese students to our campuses. I think it's really important. They're a great source of knowledge and friendships and connections.
I would assume you're not advocating for complete open, right? There have been problems. In general, I think you want to welcome them, but if there are issues with those students, you would still want to have certain policies in place.
Just like, I guess, with any other students,
Yes.
they don't want to be, we want to be country agnostic. But I think generally the problems with students, any international students, have been very minimal. Some of the more sensitive issues exist in research rather than in the student engagement. We also want to see more Australians going to China, the same as we want to see more Americans going to China, both professionals and students. So we don't want that academic and student mobility to freeze like what we see with some American universities and American academics. We want that to continue. We also want to continue doing research with China because it's such a big power in that space, and to make sure that we manage the risk and rewards of research collaborations carefully. Just like we all want for some parts of the economic and the trade system to survive, we want the research and education system to survive as well.
When a country or institution, organization is in a stronger place, they could be more protective of what they have. Even China now is starting to think about whether they should restrict their technology export or even talent mobility. China is also starting to think about how to protect their own assets in that sense. So it'll be quite interesting next few years.
That's a very good point. Some of the fields of research where China actually has a strategic advantage, the Chinese government is putting some restrictions on international collaborations.
When you're framing the world as competition, lack of trust, that's just part of the result. Well, thank you so much for talking to us about what's going on between Australia and China, especially in the higher ed sector. My conversation with Philipp is a reminder that the choice facing universities and countries is not simply engagement or decoupling. The more difficult task is learning how to sustain meaningful international connections while managing real risks to research, technology, intellectual property, institutional integrity, and people. Australia's experience may offer useful lessons for other countries trying to find a more durable middle ground in their relationships with China. This is Perspectives with Wenchi Yu, where we analyze the policies and political strategies of Trump 2.0 and their implications for Asia, China, Taiwan, and beyond. Thank you for watching and listening. We value your feedback. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel and podcast. See you next time.